Good morning. Today we continue our focus for the year as we think about being a fellowship of image bearers. And 3 weeks ago, Andrew Bean presented a lesson on equipping the saints, introducing that concept. And what I'd like to do today as an introduction is to briefly review some of that material. And if you haven't heard that, I encourage you to listen to Andrew's lesson, or listen to it again if you have heard it, available on YouTube. You may have noticed that the most valuable part of my lessons is telling you to listen to someone else's lessons, and so I encourage you to do that. But he talked about fellowship, and how fellowship is clearly between me and God. That is part of God's design. But as we think about being a fellowship of image bearers, it's also true that there's a fellowship amongst all of us as image bearers, and that has a commonality, but beyond a commonality, it is a joint sharing or participation together, and that participation together is with a purpose, ultimately, to fulfill God's purposes and to carry out His work. And so Andrew walked us through the book of Ephesians and noted that that book is nicely broken down into a couple different sections. And if you look at the third line there, as we think specifically about image bearers, it can be broken down as the work of God, and then our work as being His image bearers. And he highlighted this text in chapter 2 of Ephesians, down towards the bottom where it talks about Christ Himself being the chief cornerstone, and gave us this image of the temple. And we see us being built together as a temple, again, for purpose. And has helped us by providing this actual physical pictorial image as a way for us to imagine and see what is going on in this temple. And so this is not a complete listing of everyone who's part of the body here, but a representative sample. And you see there as being pillars or buttress of the truth to hold it up and completing that function that is done, again, together as image bearers. And then I won't walk through this slide in any detail at all, but you see the kind of the key verse there at the top, Ephesians 4, verse 12, for the equipping of the saints for the work of service to the building up of the body of Christ. So the purpose of the equipping is for the work of ministry, for the building of the body. But what we're talking about this month is specifically about that equipping step, equipping the saints. And so we had some key takeaways, and I'd like to just highlight a couple of these. One is the second one then, the idea of equipping for ministry or for body building. And again, that's the goal of the equipping. And the other thing that you note here is, as Andrew explained it, the member to member. It's not that we hire or support a full-time evangelist who equips us. We are to be equipping each other, a member-to-member ministry. And so, again, Andrew presented the first lesson on equipping the saints, or on equipping. And in the next 3 lessons are going to be equipping the elderly, which was assigned to me. So I see what's going on here. I get the elderly. And then equipping the family and equipping the young. And this gives me an opportunity just to thank these 3 men listed, Andrew, Andy, and Abe. We call them the A-team, because they were instrumental in getting together and thinking and planning carefully about what we would be kind of focusing on this year. So appreciate those men, as well as having taken the responsibility to present several lessons, several meaty lessons. Meaty as in, when you hear them, it's something you have to chew on to really digest and get the full impact of what those lessons are about. So really appreciate the work that they have done. Then you see there kind of a preview of coming things when we talk about burden bearing. And just a note here, when you think about equipping the saints, obviously when you think about equipping, you think about imparting God's word through teaching or through training. And those things are needed for any age group. But what I'm going to be focusing more on is the approach when you think about specifically the age group that I'm going to be talking about. So equipping the elderly. That's our lesson for today. So if you look at this, again, this image, this picture that Andrew has put together for us, and you can see there, I think it shows up, I've put boxes around some of the faces, yellow boxes. And so let me just say that if you have a box around you and you don't think that you're in the elderly category, then I'll apologize publicly now, and if you see me in person, I can do that in person. Or maybe less likely, if you wanted to be included in that group and you don't have a box around your face, then I can make that apology as well. But I think it's pretty close. I think I tried to hit the age 65 sort of arbitrarily as a cutoff. And I thought maybe I should include the Holmans, but nobody knows how old the Holmans are, and they haven't aged in like 10 years. So, and Josh told me that he is not elderly, so he said maybe give it 10 years, and then I can add him to the yellow box list. But just some observations about that image as we think about equipping this group of people. One, we have many seasoned citizens in this group. When I came here as a freshman in 1983, the group in Lafayette was known as a young group. There was a lot of young couples, young families, young children, and I hate to break it to you, but a lot of you people have gotten old. I counted maybe about 40, and that's, again, where you make the cutoff, but about 40 in this age group. That's a lot of people in a group of this size. So you really can't look at the church in Lafayette and say they're a young church. That's not us. We have a lot of these people, and so it applies when you're thinking about this, but it really applies to us because we have a lot of people in this category. And each one of those people in this category is important. If I was Bill Miller, I'd make a fist, and I'd get loud, and I'd say, each one is important. And each one is important. If you think about those as blocks in a pillar or a structure, what would happen if you took out the yellow blocks? Wouldn't be a good situation, would it? Now, it's not a perfect analogy. I'm not suggesting that if you take out any one of those, that the church is going to collapse and can no longer perform or function. But thinking of it maybe as more of a 3D construct where you have an array of pillars, and if one of them was removed, it would still do its job, right? But what I will say is if you remove any one of those, or any one of those is not functioning up to what they can do, that we as a collective fellowship are not being as effective as we can be, or as we could be. And so each one of those is important. Notice that the elderly are not clustered together. They're not over here on some pillar by themselves. I appreciate the way Andrew put that together. They're intermingled throughout. If you look on the bottom row, I think we got Kylie, and then Thelma, and then Jared, not Devin, and then the Barkuses. Okay, you see the age groups intermingled, some significant age differences. They're not over here by themselves as a group. They're scattered throughout, and that's with intent. And along with that, the elderly are not uniform in their thinking, understanding, and experience. The elderly are not some monolithic group of people who all think the same way and profess exactly the same thing. Now, to be sure, they do share some common experiences. Probably every one of those who has a yellow box around them could probably, maybe likely tell you where they were and what they were doing when they heard about the Kennedy assassination, okay, for example. They share that. But these people also have a diverse and very different set of experiences. And so let's not us, those who aren't in that category, make the mistake of thinking that all old people are alike. Just like any other age group, all old people are not alike. Older people. So things to consider. Things to consider about this age group, because there are some commonalities, and I'll try to go through these quickly because I listed several. There are physical and mental limitations that occur at this age group, and I think we recognize that. You know, when Fred's going to get some help on clearing the snow from the parking lot, he doesn't drive down to Creasy and pick up his mom and John's mom and say, okay, ladies, let's get to work, right? They have some physical limitations. They can't do that kind of activity. And there are some mental limitations. Memory, and those of us who don't consider ourselves in this category are already experiencing this, and it can be frustrating when you can't remember something that you know, and you just can't access it. And so recognize that. 4 in 5 older adults have at least one chronic condition or illness. For you younger people, if you've had an illness that lasted a long time, like a week or a month, you know how that can impact you, the way you think, the way you feel, your emotional state. Think about having a chronic illness that has lasted for years, okay? So when you're thinking about equipping, these people recognize that in a lot of cases, 4 out of 5, that's what's going on in their life. Older people are not children, and they don't want to be treated like one. You may have heard someone talk about their parent or their grandparent and say, well, they act like a child, so I have to treat them like a child. Be very careful with that, what you think that you have to do, and how you are treating that older person. These older people, they know a lot. I have this phrase here, crystallized intelligence, and some who study these kind of things talk about a couple different kinds of intelligence. Fluid intelligence is the ability to reason and to learn and to solve problems. And actually, some say that starts to taper off even as early as age 20. But crystallized intelligence is this accumulation of learning that you gain over time, and it continues to grow as you get older. So recognize that these older folks, they have a lot that they know. They have a lot of crystallized intelligence, and that rounds out what they know. Wisdom is with aged men, with long life is understanding. Self-confidence drops off. You think back to the first item, and you could see how that would impact your feeling about yourself. And especially for men in the older generations who for decades their feeling of worth and value has been tied to their occupation, and now they no longer are doing that. They're in their retirement years. You can see how that self-confidence can drop off in the older years. At the same time, stress drops off. The stress of the job, the stress of raising the family, the stress of taking care of the home, a lot of those things. And so the stress level drops off, again, in general. By age 75, about 1 in 3 men and 1 in 2 women don't get any physical activity. No comment now, just remember that. Talk about that a little bit later. They are honored by God. We live in a culture that idolizes youth, promotes youth, and sadly wants to push older aside. That's not God. God honors the older. A gray head is a crown of glory, according to the proverb. And finally, older people struggle with temptation and sin. We tend to sometimes get the idea that, well, once you're old, you don't have to deal with temptation anymore because you're old. That's not the way it works. And we'll talk about that in a little bit too. So again, as we think about equipping, think about some of these things and maybe get the brain juices flowing a little bit about how that would impact the approach. When Andrew talked about equipping, he talked about fixing what is broken. That's the term that's used in Matthew chapter 4, verse 21, specifically talk about mending nets and supplying what is missing, that you can complete what is lacking in your faith. And that root word there, equipping, used for equipping, is found in other places in Scripture. In Galatians chapter 6, to restore through correction. Anyone caught in a trespass, you who are spiritual, restore such a one. That's equipping. Jesus said a pupil, after he has been fully trained, will be like his teacher. Training is equipping. And then the idea of completing or perfecting. So all these things taken together rounds out what it is to equip. And so think about those again in light of talking about the elderly, the older folks. So, equipping. Thinking about equipping the older folks. First thing I have here is to tell them that they are important and needed. We said earlier that they are important, and the idea here is as you're equipping older folks, make sure you tell them that they are important and needed. There's a movie came out several years ago called The Help, and the woman on there, she was the domestic help, and she was in charge, you might say, of this little girl, and she told her, "You is smart, you was kind, you was important. That was very sweet. It was very kind of her. But necessarily, two of those things might not be true, right? You may not be that smart. But you know what? It doesn't matter. The infinite I am, Jesus, is not impressed with your intelligence or mine. He doesn't care how smart you are. You may not be kind, but you should be, and you can be, and we can help with equipping people to be those things. But what is always true, no matter what, is that you are important to God and to Jesus. Excuse me, we are made in His image, so we are important to Him. So let's make sure that we're doing that with our older folks, our older generation. And I was going to say we, but I made it personal. If I ever make an older person feel like they are not important, then it is I who am at fault, and I am the one who needs to repent and ask for forgiveness. So if you're an older folk here and you've been made to feel that way, then you are deserving of an apology because you're important and you're needed in this body. Remind them, and I said, and ourselves of what they can do. We may need to remind ourselves first and then remind them. Old folks don't need to be reminded of what they can't do. They know that already. I've heard Joe talk about when he was in high school. Maybe you've never heard this. When he was in high school, he played basketball, and he could stand flat-footed, holding the ball underneath the basket, without even taking a running jump, flat-footed, jump up and dunk the basketball. How many of you could do that in high school? I certainly couldn't. At my best, I could take a running jump and just touch the rim. Well, Joe can't do that anymore, and he doesn't need us to tell him that. He knows that. He's aware of that. But what we may need to do, and what I'm saying we probably should do, is remind the older folks what they can do. And they can do maybe a lot more than we have been giving them credit for being able to do. I have a text here talking about Moses. It says, "Now the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, this is what applies to the Levites. From 25 years old and upward, they shall enter to perform service in the work of the tent of meeting. But at the age of 50 years, they shall retire from service in the work and not work anymore. They may, however, assist their brothers in the tent of meeting to keep an obligation, but they themselves shall do no work." So we see here God setting an age restriction on those who would serve in the tabernacle. And if you think about the work they had to do, it was long hours. This is carrying around animals and cutting them up and putting them on the altar. I mean, it was hard work. And God said, we're going to have a restriction on this. You need to be of a maturity level to do the work, but there gets a time where it's too much work. But notice here that beyond that age, and there is no age restriction, you can assist in doing the work. There is still work that you can do. So things like teaching, maybe not teaching like I'm doing now, or maybe not teaching a class because of some of the limitations we talked about, but certainly teaching one-on-one or in a small group setting, mentoring a father, mentoring a young mother, leading a small group. I don't know how often we've had an elderly person lead a small group. Is that something that an elderly person can do? Sometimes we want to limit, when we talk about these kind of things, what an elderly person can do to, folding the bulletin or sending out a card. If those are things you can do, I don't mean to minimize those, do those, and thank you for your service to God. But let's not limit the scope of what our older folks can do. Let's remind ourselves and then remind them of the value that they can have in service to God and this family. Actively seek and graciously accept their counsel and help. I realize this is too small to read for probably most of you, but I wanted to get it all on one slide. This is from Exodus chapter 18. It came about the next day that Moses sat to judge the people, and the people stood about Moses from the morning until the evening. Now when Moses' father-in-law saw all that he was doing for the people, he said, "What is this that you are doing for the people? Why do you alone sit as judge, and all the people stand about you from morning until evening?" Moses said to his father-in-law, "Because the people come to me to inquire of God. When they have a dispute, it comes to me, and I judge between a man and his neighbor, and make known the statutes of God and his laws. Moses' father-in-law said to him, the thing that you are doing is not good. You will surely wear out, both yourself and these people who are with you, for the task is too heavy for you. You cannot do it alone. So just think about this. We have a group of people, maybe a couple million people, and they're all coming to Moses with any disputes they have, when they have need of understanding what God's law says about it. So he's out there from morning until evening, talking to person after person, and they're all standing around waiting their turn. So look at the wisdom here of his father-in-law. He says, this is not good for you, Moses, and it's not good for them. It's not good for the collective, what's going on here. So he gives counsel. Now listen to me. I will give you counsel, and God be with you. You be the people's representative before God, and you bring the disputes to God. Then teach them the statutes and the laws, and make known to them the way in which they are to walk and the work they are to do. Furthermore, you shall select out of all the people able men who fear God, men of truth, those who hate dishonest gain, and you shall place these over them as a leader of thousands, of hundreds, of fifties, and of tens. Let them judge the people at all times, and let it be that every major dispute they will bring to you, but every minor dispute they themselves will judge. So it will be easier for you, and they will bear the burden with you. If you do this thing, and God so commands, then you will be able to endure, and all these people also will go to their place in peace. What a great wisdom, what great counsel. It's going to be better for Moses. It's going to be better for the people. It's going to be better for those who are now stepping up and taking on new responsibilities and growing, because Moses isn't going to be around forever, right? And so look at that last line. Moses listened to his father-in-law and did all that he had. Moses has been hand-selected by God to lead his people out of Egypt toward the promised land. And yet he is listening to someone older and listening to their counsel. And think about this. Moses is 80 years old. He's no kid, but he still has humility, because Moses was legendary for his humility, to listen to someone older to him, to get that counsel. Listen graciously, and then actually do it. Great example. Show them honor and respect. When you're dealing with an older person, honor and respect. Leviticus says, you shall rise up before the gray-headed and honor the aged, and you shall reveal your God, I am Yahweh. And just observe in that verse that honoring the gray-headed is linked with revering God. Those two are linked together in that passage. Actively encourage their participation and listen to them. Kind of goes back to the previous one a little bit. The righteous man in Psalms, the righteous man will flourish like the palm tree. He will grow like a cedar in Lebanon. Planted in the house of God, they will flourish in the courts of our God. They will still yield fruit in their old age. They shall be full of sap and very green, to declare that the Lord is upright. He is my rock, and there is no unrighteousness in him. Still able to yield fruit in old age. So let me not move on from that. So let's make sure that we are actively, as we think about equipping, engaging our older folks, let's make sure that we are encouraging their participation. And when they participate, let's listen to them. Remind them in whom their strength lies. We talked about the earlier passage. When you get older, you start to have physical limitations. You start having illnesses, a lot of times chronic illnesses. The strength wanes, and as you are aware, I'm sure, those things start to impact your mind and your emotions and even your spiritual well-being. Let's remind, as we equip our old folks, where true strength lies. In Isaiah, he gives strength to the weary, and to him who lacks might, he increases power. Though youths grow weary and tired, and vigorous young men stumble badly, yet those who wait on Yahweh will gain new strength. They will mount up with wings like eagles. They will run and not get tired. They will walk and not become weary. How does that sound, old folks? To run and not get tired. To walk and not get weary. This is not physically. This is in our spirit, and that's where the true strength lies. And even older folks who have that accumulated knowledge can sometimes forget that. As we equip them, let's come alongside and remind them of that. My flesh and my heart may fail, but God is the strength of my heart and my portion forever. Psalm 73. Correct, as we think about correction as a form of equipping. Talked about that earlier in Galatians. Correct to restore with gentleness and humility. Now, we should do that with everyone. Anyone you correct should be done with gentleness and humility. But as we think about the older people, okay, their condition, their mindset, the limitations, the honor, all those things, put that all in there and think about how you are approaching this older person. And the correction is for the purpose of restoration, okay? Paul told Timothy, do not sharply rebuke an older man, but rather appeal to him as a father. The older, so the same applies to the women, the older women as mothers. I highlighted those two words, rebuke and appeal. Don't rebuke, but appeal. That word rebuke literally means to strike upon or to beat upon and chastise. Shameful to think that any of us approaching an older person to provide correction for the restoration would literally strike upon them with our words or beat upon them with our words. Look at the contrast to appeal, to call to one side, comfort, implore, entreat, plead, exhort, encourage, or urge. When we're dealing with anyone, and even take another level, when you're dealing with older folks that need correction, make sure you're appealing and not rebuking. And help them bear their temptation and sin burdens. I said it's often easy for us to get the idea that older folks don't deal with temptation. They don't deal with sin. As we think about equipping, bearing that is part of equipping as well. Bear one of his burdens and thereby fulfill the law of Christ. And there's going to be lessons coming up on burden bearing, so I won't go into much more detail on that. But I do want to make some observations about this age group. I sent out an email to several in this age group and got a few responses. And it was interesting to see the replies. I asked the question if they were willing to share what temptations do you deal with, what sins do you deal with. And I was able to take those and sort of group those into buckets, you might say. And so we had the retirement mentality. That is, I'm older and I've worked and now I kind of want to take it easy. Okay, so that temptation is there. Filling time, you might say wasting time on TV, pets. Had one tell me about an older woman who all she deals with is her cats. That's all she talks about. That's all she spends her time on. That's all she wants to interact, tell you about is her cats. Okay? And I'm not anti-cat, by the way. We lost our own beloved kitty not long ago, and I miss her. So it's not about the pets or the cats. It's about what is the filling of time. Hobbies, puzzles. Puzzles are great, especially great for older folks to keep the mind engaged and working, all right? So if you're doing the word search or the whatever, then yeah, do those. But if that's how you fill your whole day, that's a different story. The idea of being self-focused, thinking about my pain, my health. Now it's my time. I'm not working anymore. The kids are raised, and now it's little me time. Heard the idea of concerns of the present, thinking about COVID and politics, the economy, all those kind of things. Fears of the future. Are my finances going to hold out? Am I on a fixed income? Is my health going to hold out? Regrets of the past, sins I've committed, choices I've made, things I should have done but didn't do, and dwelling on those things. As you look at that list, does any of that look familiar? Maybe with the exception of retirement mentality, I think we could probably say that a lot of us have experienced temptation or sin issues with a lot of those things. How we spend our time, focusing on self, concerns about present and future. The point is, the temptation or sin burdens and categories of these older folks is not necessarily unique. Maybe the details of what they're thinking about is a little bit unique. But the point is, they're still there. Those categories are still there, and it's still something that we need to, as we think about equipping our older folks, to help them bear that. One person in his email response said, "I am too concerned about worldly things." That's how he summarized it. And don't raise your hand, but can you relate? Are you too concerned about worldly things to think about things of a higher plane? And years ago, this was not one that I spoke to recently. He's no longer with us. This was Carl Christian. But I can remember we were having a study, and it was about maintaining sexual purity. And one of the younger men asked him, "Do you still have any temptation in that area?" Because again, we tend to think we get so old and don't even think about it anymore. Carl's response was, "I'm still a man." And as long as each one of us draws breath until that final breath is exhaled, we're still a man or a woman. We're a human. And these things, temptation and sin, are going to be part of our life. And we, you all, as younger folks, help these older folks bear those burdens. That's part of equipping. And finally, this is the last one, walk with them. We think about the idea of a figurative sense, to go walk with someone on their Christian walk, and we should do that. What we're talking about is walking with them. I'm talking about physically, going for a walk with them. I heard back from Bill, and he said, we maybe need to get creative on some of these things when we think about equipping older folks. Go back to this statement. By age 75, about 1 in 3 men and 1 in 2 women don't get any physical activity. I think we probably all recognize how much physical activity is interconnected with obviously our physical well-being, but our mental well-being, our emotional well-being, our spiritual well-being. You sit on the couch, you're sedentary, the brain's really not doing much. You get up, you go for a walk, you get the blood moving, get a little oxygenated in there, and some things happen. You start feeling better, and you feel like you can do the work of the ministry. So what if you just went for a walk with an older person? Got the blood moving, got the oxygen going, and as you did that, you might find that you have opportunity to do several of these other things and multitask a little bit. So just think about that, and think about these things as we think about equipping this age group. And one of the good things about going first is anything I didn't say that I should have said, those guys who come after me can fill in, spackle over those unsmooth spots, and help us all as we think about equipping one another. Before we close, we want to offer the opportunity for anyone who may need to respond to the invitation of Jesus Christ to be one of His, or if you have a spiritual need of any sort that you want to make known to the group here, we ask that you would come while we stand and sing.